Hello, welcome to Jason the Old Millennial. My name is Jason, speaking to you here in my basement in the great state of Kansas. Today's video, I'm doing another deep dive, and this is a big one of the biggest bands of all time I'm finally getting around to talking about, and that is the Rolling Stones. Yes, the Rolling Stones, one of the biggest British rock invasion bands of the 60s period. It's frankly been around longer than any band probably in history. Still going strong today with an album that came out last year. Crazy enough. Yeah, so this will be a fun video. We're going to talk about kind of their history, their big albums, their big hits, how they started, and how their career went, and kind of give some opinions on what are some of my favorite of their albums and songs and all that. Anyway, so I hope this will be a good one for all of you here on Jason the Old Millennial. Hello everybody, I hope everybody's doing well here on a Sunday night. It's a pretty late night, it's almost 11 o'clock here in Kansas. Yeah, I'm doing another late night video and I'll be editing this, hopefully, and putting it out sometime before midnight, hopefully. By the way, it's been amazing here in Kansas. I'm actually wearing shorts and a t-shirt today, which is crazy. It's, it's late February, it's February. February is, usually the harshest winter month in Kansas, and yet we've been getting 60 to 70 degree weather this last week, and it's like, holy cow. I can't believe how warm it is outside, and I can actually wear shorts in February. But but it's been nice. Who knows? Tomorrow it could snow. Kansas is that way. One day I'm wearing shorts, next day I'm shoveling snow out my driveway. That happens many times. But I'll enjoy it while I can. This is a band I've been wanting to do for a while. I've been preparing for this a long time ago. Actually, I did a poll almost 6 months ago, probably, I don't know, where I was like, there's a couple bands and artists that I'm not big fans of, but I thought I would give them a second chance because there's such a huge fandom, that I put down a poll of some band artists that I'm not a fan of and had them, vote on who I should do a deep dive. So the idea was like, I'm going to give this band a second chance and do a deep dive on them and see if they can change my mind, change me around to becoming more of a fan of theirs. So one of the bands was the Rolling Stones. I've never been a big fan of the Rolling Stones ever since I was a kid. In fact, growing up, I first became a huge Beatles fan, of course, and so I was into 60s music. I listened to a lot of 60s and 70s. So obviously I heard a lot of Rolling Stones songs. They were all over the radio, the oldies station that I was listening to. And, for the most part, there's some okay stuff there. I was like, yeah, there's some decent stuff here and there, and some really good stuff here and there too, that I go, oh, that's actually really good. But I don't know, I never really clinged on to them like I did, other 60s bands, to be honest. And in fact, a lot of it is maybe from my parents. My parents absolutely despise the Rolling Stones. They never liked the Rolling Stones. In fact, my dad, I think, told me when I was young that if you're a Beatles fan, you can't like the Rolling Stones. So I was a big Beatles fan, so I'm like, okay, I guess I can't like the Rolling Stones. So I've always had a negative feeling towards them, even from a young age, to be honest. And I think a lot of that is like, they were really kind of like the anti-Beatles maybe, and that's why my dad didn't like them. Like I said, they were different in that they were more of a blues rock band, while the Beatles really were rock, pop, and then throw in some good ballads in there as well. But they didn't really do a lot of blues rock. The Beatles, I never had that feeling. And me personally, I'm not a big fan of blues rock at all, or blues music in total. It's never been my thing. I definitely like more just regular rock and pop music. It's always in folk music, folk rock, all that stuff. That's my favorite genre of music. So the Rolling Stones, I think what I've never liked about them is they go more bluesy in a way that I never really enjoyed. And I don't know, I think a lot of it's their image. Mick Jagger, he's a little weird. I mean, he's very flamboyant on stage, the way he moves around. He does the rooster thing, and I think, especially older age, he definitely not a good looking guy. He's, lots of wear and tear on that face. through lots of drugs and alcohol. Same thing with Keith Richards. Definitely looked very haggard, and also he's known for, of course, it's very, no secret that, definitely gets around with the ladies, let's say. And not that every rock star gets around the ladies, so that's not a big deal. But I don't know. I think there's something almost obscene with Mick Jagger and his stories. And obviously drugs and alcohol and all that. I don't know. I think my parents just never liked Mick Jagger and kind of saw him as like this guy is like, and my parents probably put a lot on that image, and like it's not about the music, about the image. Plus, I don't think they liked the music of the Rolling Stones. Like I said, my parents liked more of the poppy music, and he was more of this grungy like rock, blues rock music. So it wasn't in my parents' wheelhouse. It wasn't really in my wheelhouse either growing up, to be honest. So growing up, I never would call myself a Rolling Stones fan. Though I think there are some good songs. I'd be like, yeah, their hit songs are good, but never thought I'd ever get into their albums. And sometimes I would listen to an album and go, it's not a very good album. Anyway, so yeah, so it's an interesting deep dive for me. It's coming from someone who's really not a fan of Rolling Stones. I'd also say Mick Jagger, I'm not a big fan of his vocals. He's one of the biggest lead singers, frontman, and he's probably my least favorite frontman, to be honest. If you compare him to Freddie Mercury, Robert Plant, Roger Daltrey, to name a few, but any frontman, he's like down the list, my frontman. I don't know, he has just something about his voice, a little grating to the ears at times. Anyways, so that's kind of my feeling coming into this Rolling Stones. And yeah, I'll give you my thoughts though, going through, I went through all 24 of their UK albums. They have UK and US albums. There's a couple US albums that the UK don't have, but I thought I'd go through UK since they're from England. I like to go through their country's albums, kind of see what they were giving to their country, I guess. I always feel like that's the album, at least for the Beatles, their albums that we all listen to are the UK albums. So I thought I'd do the same thing with Rolling Stones. All right, saying all that, let's get into kind of a little bit of how the Rolling Stones started. What is the history of the Rolling Stones? Well, really starts in 1950s. We have Mick Jagger and Keith Richards are childhood friends. They go to school together, and they end up starting a band together later on. In 1961, they formed a band called the Blues Boys, and you can judge from that name, they were a blues rock band, played blues rock covers anyways. And they were in London. Of course, this is around the London area, which was the big area for music. Of course, the kind of capital of music, capital of the country, biggest city in the country. While they were playing in London, they would often go to a jazz club called the Ealing Jazz Club, where they would meet two other individuals that were in a band. These individuals were Brian Jones, who played guitar, and Charlie Watts, who was a drummer, and they were in a band called Blues Incorporation. Again, obviously playing blues rock cover songs and bluesy type songs. And so they were hanging out. They kind of met, I guess, started liking, they hang out and was really kind of enjoying each other. They liked each other's music. And it's one of those things where it's funny, they were in two different bands, but yet they were like, maybe we should form a band, We got Mick Jagger, lead singer. We got a lead guitar player in Keith Richards, another guitar player in Brian Jones, and also drummer. He had, all they needed was a bass player, basically, and they had themselves a band. So yeah, and at this point, it should be said that Brian Jones was really kind of the leader of the band. I think was maybe really the one who kind of started the band and kind of came up with the idea of forming this band together. So you have to give a lot to Brian Jones, I think, early on for forming the Rolling Stones. Anyway, so they agreed to come together. Brian Jones came up with the name the Rolling Stones off of a Muddy Waters song called Rollin' Stone. So I took it right off of Muddy Waters, which is one of their favorite individuals who's, big blues rock player, blues kind of guitar player. Anyway, so they were really more of just a blues cover band, blues rock cover band. And they played a lot of, like I said, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, all of that type of music of the 50s. This early 60s, they were playing a lot of those great big 50s hits, as like the Beatles did as well. Anyways, and so they evidently were good enough that they got signed on by Decca Records in 1964. And of course, I think it has to be said, Decca Records, what I think about Decca Records most is that was the company that turned down the Beatles. The Beatles went to Decca Records first, and they turned them down and said, guitar bands are on the way out, which obviously they were obviously very, very wrong. And it was a pretty misstep to turn down the Beatles at that point. Beatles would go on to sign with EMI in 1962. And then 1963, of course, came out with a bunch of #1 hits and #1 record, and obviously took off from there and became the biggest band in England at that point. Now we're talking about 1964. They haven't come to America yet, but they're about to. They're getting to that point where they're probably coming to America at that point, because it was early 1964. Of course, February 9th when they played it at Sullivan Show. So they're expanding from being the biggest band in England, biggest band in Europe, to being the biggest band in the world when they came to America. So at this point, I'm guessing Decca probably was like, okay, we messed up there. And then when they saw the Rolling Stones, were like, okay, rock and roll bands are not on their way out like we thought. We better catch up the next big English rock band, and not miss out like we did with the Beatles. So that's my guess is why then Decca Records ended up signing on the Rolling Stones. Like I said, this was a big period for all British bands. After the Beatles made it big in America in '64 especially, we were craving for more British bands, because after the Beatles, we was like, okay, is there another band like the Beatles? Are there other bands that are going to hit as big? Of course, nobody can hit as big as the Beatles, but you still were looking for that next big thing, and that was English rock bands. And so a lot of English rock bands kind of flirted into the US at this point, and everybody was signing. British rock bands were getting signed like hotcakes at this point. So I'm sure the Rolling Stones was kind of part of that whole movement of the British invasion, where once the Beatles made it big, they got signed on like a lot of bands did. Anyway, so Decca signs them on. They make their first album in 1964. In the UK, it was called The Rolling Stones, their self-titled album. United States, they came out with an album called England's Newest Hitmakers, which I think is one of the funniest names for a debut album. Really putting on strong there. Obviously they're going off, like I said, the Beatles. Beatles was the English hitmaker, and now here's the newest English hitmakers, the Rolling Stones. So you watch and you go, oh, okay, I'm gonna buy this as their newest hitmakers. But yeah, so their self-titled is really just cover songs. At this point, they weren't writing original songs. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards weren't writing original stuff yet, and so all they knew were cover songs. So it's a cover album, and to me, it's a really bad debut. I don't think it did particularly that great. I don't think it charted really huge, but yeah, if you listen to it now, you go, wow, this is Rolling Stones. Wow, it doesn't sound like the Rolling Stones to me. It feels like the Rolling Stones are trying to be somebody else. I don't know. It just doesn't have that Rolling Stones feel. They obviously doing covers. I think they haven't found their voice or their unique sound yet at that point. So yeah, it's very disappointing if you start off with that album and you go, wow, this is a downturn. The first album, not so bad because they kept making albums, I guess. What's interesting is they went to the Beatles, in fact, and they said, hey, can you help us out? We need a hit song, because we aren't writing hit songs. We're just doing covers, and we need a hit song to really help us out. And Lennon McCartney, of course, wrote a bunch of songs at that time. And they said, yeah, we'll give you a song. So they gave him I Want to Be Your Man. Anyways, and so they took it and made a hit song out of it. It was number 13 in the UK. So it was one of their first, kind of somewhat big hits, was a Lennon McCartney song, interesting enough. And of course, I've heard, I think John Lennon say that, of course, we're not going to give them our best material. I mean, we're obviously going to keep our best material for ourselves, but it was one of their maybe lesser known writings, but yeah, it did well with the Stones. It ended up going on the Beatles with the Beatles album, their second album, UK album, which Ringo sings it. If you compare the two, I think the Rolling Stones actually do a little bit better job, because Mick Jagger's a little bit better rock singer than Ringo is. So, and I think they do a little bit better with rock than the Beatles did at this point, as far as that's concerned, in a sense. So, actually not a bad song for them. At this point, I think they did come out with the Rolling Stones #2. Is their second album. I think it's different in America. It was called Rolling Stones Now or something like that. But yeah, second album, again, a lot of cover songs, not a lot of original stuff on there. Again, not a very good album in my opinion. But at this point, I don't know if it was the manager or the producer, someone said, okay, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, we need you guys to write original songs. You know, we need you to become our Lennon McCartney of the band, basically. And so they basically, what I've heard is that they stuck them like in a room and locked the door basically and wouldn't let them out until they wrote an original song or wrote some original songs. So they kind of were forced against their will, because I guess my guess is Mick Jagger and Keith Richards never thought about writing original stuff, or wasn't really, they didn't know if they could. I mean, nobody knew if they could write a hit song, you know. That just wasn't something they did. Like Lennon McCartney was working feverishly every day writing new material, and I don't think that was what Mick Jagger and Keith Richards was doing. So, but when they were forced to, they ended up coming up some good original stuff, and I think that really helped the band, because I don't think the Rolling Stones could become one of the biggest, maybe the second biggest band outside the Beatles, if they didn't come up with their own original material. Because doing cover songs only can go so far. I think you really need some hit original songs. So if they weren't able to hit some original stuff at this point, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't go very far and they would get dropped like that. I don't know, maybe quit. Who knows, go their separate ways. Who knows? But as we see from history, they could write hit songs, and they would continue to do that. In fact, they had 2 number 1 hits that they came out with at this point. It's All Over Now and Little Red Rooster, 2 songs I'm not real familiar with, but they were both number 1 hits, it looks like, in the UK. Their second album, though, actually did pretty good. It went number 2 in the UK, number 5 in the US. So, wait a minute, sorry. I think it went number 1. No, number 2, I think, in the UK. Yeah, number 5 in the US. So, still did very well. So, in my opinion, not very good, but I guess they liked it better. They also had a single called The Last Time, and that went number 1. So they're hitting some number 1s in the UK. I think they haven't hit in the US at this point, but in the UK they're hitting some number 1 songs. They're kind of proving that they could write hit songs, and they continue to write together. At this point, they would come up with a number 1 hit in the US, and that was I Can't Get No Satisfaction in 1965. First number 1 hit in the US. Really the first that really kind of, I think, to me, that's the signature Rolling Stones song, especially early on. Like, this is early Rolling Stones, of course, and that was a huge song. In fact, you know, I think that was probably the first Rolling Stones song I ever heard. I remember being a kid and listening to, you know, the oldie station, and that song was on quite a bit. And yeah, I've always been like, ah, that's a pretty good song. I mean, it has that very iconic riff at the beginning, bum 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 bum, and then Mick Jagger definitely made that song his own with his vocal interpretation of I can't get no satisfaction. I mean, great vocal work from Mick Jagger. Like I said, I don't like his vocals, but I think they're good on this song. It's a solid, you know, mid-60s rock song, obviously very catchy, and he even puts in a lot of effort in I can't get no, like he really belts it out, which I like anyways. And yeah, solid song, obviously one of the biggest hits of all time. Really got in the US market, I think, with that song. The third album is called Out of Our Heads, which is actually a UK version and a US version, which there's a big difference, I found out, funny enough. But they both went number 1 in the UK and US, so this is the first really huge album for them, Out of Our Heads, and just the third album. So, and I think I think it helps that they had a hit song with I Can't Get No Satisfaction in the US version. But that they were starting to write original songs, I think, really helped. They still didn't have all originals. There's still some covers here and some originals. But obviously, like I said, this definitely took off more than the first 2 albums. So I think, and like I said, I think the original stuff, like I Can't Get No Satisfaction, definitely made them unique, made them different than other bands at the time, really showed you what they can do, gave them a voice out there that let them flourish. So definitely helped a lot. And like I said, this song actually isn't on the UK version, it's only on the US version. So I went through all the UK versions recently, and that's kind of why I'm doing this video, actually, because me and Nick ranked all of the UK Rolling Stones albums just the other day on his channel. So if you go to his channel, Townsend 505, you will see our ranking of all the Rolling Stone albums. And so I'm kind of in a Rolling Stones state of mind at the moment. So that's why I'm kind of doing this deep dive. Because anyways, that's just a side note. But yeah, so big album, big song. They also had another number 1 single called Get Off of My Cloud. Again, on the US version, not on the UK version of Out of Our Head. So, which is another excellent rock song at the time. So they had 2 huge songs on the US album. So obviously it did very well in both countries, I guess. Their fourth UK album, I don't know, I pay more attention to the UK albums, but this album came both in the UK and US, and this is one of the biggest albums they've ever done. Now it's called Aftermath, which came out in 1966. There's the UK version, US version. Again, they keep off the hit songs off the UK version. They're on the US version. They love, again, in the UK, they love doing this thing where you come out with a single and then you don't put it on your album. The Beatles did the same thing. Some of their best singles aren't on their albums. While in the US, they don't mind that, don't think about that, I guess, as much. And they're like, yeah, we're going to put the hits on here, which helped the US albums quite a bit. It makes you frustrated when you listen to UK albums. You're like, you idiots. But they didn't think about making great albums, I think. They thought more about, we're going to make a great single, and the singles are going to sell. And I think singles were selling more than albums. So they put more of the emphasis on putting out great singles. And then the albums almost were afterthoughts of like, okay, we're just going to put a bunch of collection of songs together, make an album, and they buy it. You know, they're fans, they'll buy it, you know, whatever. I feel like this is my take. I don't know if this is true or not, but I feel like maybe not until maybe 1965 when he came out like the Rubber Soul, and then also Pet Sounds in '66, that we start thinking of albums as, oh, these aren't just a collection of songs, but they're actually, you know, written for this album. They're put together for a reason, and there's almost, you know, they tie in together in some way. And we put in these songs together. We're making this album because we want to make a great album, and we don't want to just do singles. We want to make great albums. So that's a start. I mean, this is starting around this time of Aftermath, where it's like, okay, we're going to start trying to make good albums and not just put together a collection of songs and all that. Anyways, but they still weren't putting the big hits on the UK, so they still weren't doing that, unfortunately. But yeah, Aftermath, huge album for them, actually. Maybe their biggest or of their '60s albums. And it's their first album of all originals, and that was a big deal, I think. Like I said, we feel the same way as a Beatles fan, you know, when you get to Hard Day's Night, you go, oh wow, all Lennon McCartney songs, this is great. And then you get to Beatles for Sale, and you're like, what a letdown. There's a bunch of covers on here. And then after, I mean, Help has like 2 covers, but mostly just originals. And then it's all originals after that. And then it's like, oh, wow, this is the best stuff. You always want to, if you want to be big in a band, I think you got to rely on originals if you want to flourish, like I said before. Anyways, and so that was a good thing for them. And Aftermath, I think, doing all originals definitely helped the album. It went #1 in the UK, #2 in the US. Interesting enough, even though the US version is actually better. Because again, their biggest single, and one of their biggest singles of all time, came out at this point, and that is Paint It Black, which is on the US album, not on the UK album, which it really sucks when you listen to the UK album and you're like, where's Paint It Black? That's the best song on the album. He didn't put it on there. Also has Under My Thumb, which is on the UK version, which is really another really good song of theirs. As you see, there's a lot. They're putting a lot of hit songs, a lot of #1 singles. Their albums are all going #1, #2. So I mean, they're really becoming, like I said, maybe the Beatles, the Beach Boys, Rolling Stones at this point. Or I mean, they're definitely like a top 5 band in the world at this point, I would say. Their next album is Between the Buttons, came out in '67. They're getting a little more into psychedelic music at this point. 1967 is a big psychedelic year when you have, you know, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band come out for the Beatles. Also, Our Experience coming out for Jimi Hendrix. I think Disraeli Gears for Cream, you know. All these big psychedelic albums are starting to come out at this point. And so Between the Buttons, you're starting to get into a little more psychedelic type. Not as much as the next album, actually, even bigger. I'll get to, but this album still does pretty good. #3 in UK, #2 in US. Still top 3 albums in both countries. And they have 2 hit singles, again, that are on the US version, but on the UK version. And one of my favorite songs of the Rolling Stones of all time is Ruby Tuesday, which a single that went #3 in the UK. It didn't go #1, but man, it definitely, like I said, mostly they've been really big on their rock songs. Ruby Tuesday, I feel like, is their first big song that wasn't a rock song, but more of a, I would say almost like a ballad, pop ballad type song. And man, it's an excellent, one of the best melodies, you know, again, written by Jagger and Richards. I mean, so it proves that they can actually write a good melody, which it's like, wow, who knew, you know? But they do it with Ruby Tuesday, absolutely excellent. They also have Let's Spend the Night Together, which also was a #1 hit in the US. So 2 pretty big songs off of here as well, and another really big album. Their next album actually is called their Satanic Majesty's Request. Very odd name for an album. But it also comes out in '67, and it is very psychedelic. Like, this is a huge psychedelic album, and it's very divisive amongst Rolling Stones fans. I've heard some say it's one of their favorites, some say it's their least favorite. For me, it's one of my least favorite of the Rolling Stones. And I like psychedelic music, but yeah, for some reason with the Stones, I wasn't really into that album. It did have one somewhat hit song, She's a Rainbow, which I've heard on commercials, and a pretty catchy song. Anyway, so that's album. Then now we're getting to late '60s. I think I'll probably stop. This will be part 1 because there's so much stuff to go over. So I'll probably end with, actually I might end with that, because the next album kind of starts another huge step in the Rolling Stones career. So I'll probably end it there with Between the Buttons in '67 and Their Majesty's Satanic Request, or Satanic Majesty's Request. And because next we're gonna get into Beggar's Banquet, and that starts off one of their biggest run of albums. So we'll get to that next time in part 2, but I hopefully enjoyed a little bit of that on my thoughts and learn a little bit of history on the Rolling Stones. And yeah, so tell me what you think so far. What are some of your favorites? Tell me what your favorite early '60s albums of the Stones are, I guess, and songs. And yeah, tell me what you think, and love to read the comments, and I would appreciate that. And just thanks. I just want to thank everybody that's watched the video. Thank you for liking it, and thank you to all my subscribers for supporting the channel. I appreciate all of you.